Hello, everyone. Well, we're focusing now initially on problems. I think to begin with, when we're talking about Sharia law, we have to say that the problem is that it's discriminatory, as is all religious laws, including the Beth Din. I mean, our campaign is also opposed to the Beth Dins, regardless of whether, you know, they say that, according to them, UK law is paramount. We think that religious courts really don't have a place in deciding on family matters, child custody, divorce, marriage, and because it's so discriminatory and misogynist, really, religious law, that putting women and children into the hands of these courts is quite detrimental and scandalous, really. And I find it, you know, outrageous that these courts have been going on for so long and they are carrying on with business as usual. Now, to give you an example of Sharia law, just about what we're talking about, I mean, in a Sharia, whether you go to a Sharia council or to a Muslim arbitration tribunal in this country, according to Sharia law, a woman's testimony is worth half that of a man's. A woman doesn't have right to unilateral divorce. Men do, which is why a large majority of people going to these courts and councils are women. Women don't have a right to child custody after a preset age. This was mentioned before. And you know, of course there are times when maybe the father should have the child. It's best for the welfare of the child. But in a civil court, the welfare of the child is paramount and not, you know, giving the child over at a preset age. And of course, in an issue like inheritance, for example, girls get half of that of what boys get, and so on and so forth. So it's fundamentally very discriminatory and unfair. And I know people will say, have said that, well, you know, people who choose to go to these courts, it's voluntary. And I beg to differ. I think that, you know, there's a lot of threats and intimidations involved and pressure in forcing women to go to these courts. I mean, just to give you an example, there's a study that was done, and very little has been done actually on this issue, because it is a taboo issue in a lot of instances because of the feeling that criticism of Islam, religious law is, you know, racist and so on and so forth, which it isn't really. It's a defense of, I think, Muslim women's rights, and it's racist to allow double standards in this country and elsewhere. But there's a study that a law lecturer did at the University of Reading, and she sat in on 10 cases. And in the 10 cases that she sat in on, 4 of them had injunctions against their husbands. That means the husbands weren't even allowed to be anywhere near their wives, but they were sitting there in a Sharia council, mind you, not a Muslim arbitration tribunal, trying to renegotiate child custody, divorce, and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of that involved that makes this sort of thing not voluntary in any way, shape, or form. And you have many other examples, few, though there's still ample evidence on how these courts are discriminatory. You have the Center for Islamic Pluralism. They did a report, a study, and interviewed 70 women. Many of them were asked to stay in, made to stay in forced marriages and in violent situations, because religious courts in general, their duty is to keep the marriage together. And we know that. I mean, that's part of how religion works and religious law works. And so many of the women who were interviewed felt they didn't get a fair hearing. And there were a couple of cases that this study brought up. One was the case of a woman called Sophia, and obviously it's not her real name, but she was 13 when she was forcibly married to a cousin. 13 years old. And she went to 3 different Sharia councils, and all 3 of them, even though she told them that my marriage was forced, they told her that her marriage is legitimate under Islamic law. And now she's 30 years old, the only reason they finally granted her a divorce is because the husband agreed to it. And so there are a lot of examples like this, you know, that's available, even though not much work has been done in this area. You have the Muslim arbitration tribunals themselves saying that they judged on 7 domestic violence cases. Now, I know according to them, domestic violence is a private matter and a family matter, but it's a criminal matter in this country because of the progressive social movements and the battle that's been fought to consider domestic violence a crime. And they've, in their judgments, they've said that the women dropped their charges with the police, we've sent the men to anger management courses, and from our perspective, this is a success because we've kept the family together. And this is the fundamental problem with religious courts and religious law. there's also the question of child protection and child welfare violations. I mean, both Ronnie and David talked about this, and the law lords. You know, it's interesting. The law lords said that this woman can't be deported back to Lebanon because under Sharia law, she would be separated from her child, and that's a violation of her rights. She had fled Lebanon, fled domestic violence. And the fact that it was condoned under Sharia law in Lebanon. She fled here. They said she can't be deported because she'll lose her child. But the same thing is happening in Britain, and it seems to be okay. I know people will say, but a woman living in Britain has recourse to the civil courts. But what I want to say is that she really doesn't. She really doesn't. Because a vast majority of women who go to these courts, even though they're unhappy with the judgments, will not go to civil courts in many instances to get recourse and to complain. And I know I've spoken to a lot of lawyers on this. I mean, there's one lawyer in specific who does a lot of work on honor crimes and cases, Sharia-related cases. Unfortunately, she couldn't make it to this discussion today. But she said, you know, and I'm going to quote her, that from her perspective, Sharia councils and Muslim arbitration tribunals are one and the same thing. And she gives examples of how women have lost child custody in Sharia councils. They've lost child custody. And by the time some of these women who've become her clients have mustered up the courage to go to civil courts to try to get back custody of their children, they haven't been able to get it because, especially if children are older, she says, for example, and living in a hostile environment, they no longer want to return to their mothers either. So it does have legal implications as well. The other, just a few more points, I'm sorry, of course, I think, you know, you have people saying, well, it's up to interpretation. And I want to say that, again, leaving people's rights to interpretation and the whims of some of the most regressive and reactionary, you know, imams and, you know, religious leaders is quite scary, actually, and something that we shouldn't allow. And you know, we've heard that in Scotland yesterday, there's been a law firm that is now actually providing women both legal advice according to Scottish law, and they have an Islamic scholar sitting there and telling them what her rights will be under Sharia law. And my point is that these two are antithetical to each other, because Sharia law will tell her she doesn't have a right to divorce. She needs to stay in a violent situation. She doesn't have right to child custody. So it's quite absurd, actually, that you have someone giving legal advice under Scottish law and then legal advice under Islamic law. It makes no sense. It's ridiculous. And I think the problem is that multiculturalism has allowed us to bend over backwards to incorporate religious beliefs, cultural beliefs, whereas actually we should be saying that equality rights are for people, not for religions and beliefs. And sometimes in order to protect people's rights, we have to keep religions and beliefs out of the equation. And finally, I just want to say that it's a huge mistake to think that incorporating you know, some aspects of Sharia law is okay. I think the thing is that the civil aspect of Sharia are some of the greatest pillars of women's oppression under Islamic rule. Some of the reason why so many people flee Iran, Iraq, and Afghanistan and elsewhere to get away from this sort of oppression, and then to have it shoved down their throats again here is quite an outrage. And I think not to see the link between the civil aspects of this law and the penal aspects of it, which allows stoning for adultery and allows amputations for stealing and, you know, flogging for you know, drinking in public and execution for being gay. These two, the civil aspect is just part and parcel of that penal aspect. And what I want to say is that actually the sexism and misogyny of it are fundamentally really the same. And so we really have to have zero tolerance for Sharia courts and Muslim arbitration tribunals and say, listen, there's been years and years of struggle by progressive social movements in this country. Thank you.